The carriage door opened before Cecily Vane had finished adjusting her gloves, and the cold air of Lord Harcastle's courtyard hit her like a reminder of everything she had already gotten wrong that evening. She had not meant to go into the library. She had meant to find the retiring room, fix the pin that was slowly losing its grip on the left side of her hair, and return to the ballroom before her aunt noticed she had gone. That was the plan. Simple. Safe. The kind of plan a sensible woman makes when she has no business being at a ball this grand in the first place. But the retiring room was down the east corridor and the library was down the west, and Cecily Vane had never been good with directions in unfamiliar houses, and so the door she opened was the wrong one. Edward Ashford, 9th Duke of Wrentham, was standing at the window with a glass he had not been drinking from. He turned when the door opened. She froze when she saw him. For 3-4 seconds, neither of them moved. Then she said, "I am looking for the retiring room." He said, "This is not it." She backed out of the room. But it was already too late. Lady Dunmore had been passing in the corridor. Lady Dunmore, who had the sharpest eyes in England and the loosest lips, and who had once brought down a perfectly decent engagement with nothing more than a raised eyebrow at the right dinner table. By the time Cecily found the actual retiring room, the story had already changed 3 times in the retelling. By the time she found her aunt, the Duke of Wrentham had been alone with her for 20 minutes. By the end of the night, it was half an hour and someone had already helpfully supplied the detail that the library door had been closed, which it had not been, not even for a moment. Cecily sat in the carriage on the way home and said nothing. Her aunt said a great deal. Cecily looked out the window and thought about the 42 stones she had counted in the floor of the retiring room while she stood there, trying to remember how to breathe. She had not spoken to the Duke. She had not looked at the Duke. She had been in the wrong room for 11 seconds and it had cost her everything that was left of her good name, which had not, truthfully, been very much to begin with. Her father's study smelled of pipe smoke and something older and sadder underneath it. He was awake when she arrived, which told her the news had moved even faster than she thought. He did not ask her what had happened. He said, "We will speak to your aunt in the morning," and she understood what that meant, which was that there was nothing left to do tonight except wait. She went to her room. She did not sleep. She counted the cracks in the ceiling plaster instead, 19, if you followed the longest one all the way to the corner, and watched the sky outside her window go from black to the particular grey that comes just before dawn, the grey that looks like an apology the morning cannot quite bring itself to make. The letter arrived with the first post. It was written in a precise hand on paper of a quality Cecily had never personally touched before, the kind of paper that cost more than her second-best dress. It was addressed to her father. She was not in the room when he opened it, but she was standing close enough to the closed study door to hear the silence that followed, which was a different kind of silence than she had expected. She had expected him to call for her aunt. He called for her instead. The letter was 3 sentences. She read it twice. Then she set it down on her father's desk very carefully, the way you set down a thing you are not yet sure is real. Edward Ashford, Duke of Wrentham, was offering for her. Not in the letter. The letter was simply an indication that he intended to call that morning and would be grateful for the opportunity to speak with her father at his earliest convenience. The offer itself, when it came in person, in the same study that smelled of pipe smoke and old sadness, and Cecily was not present for it, which she had been told was correct and which she found, frankly, insulting. She waited in the parlor while it happened. She counted the roses on the wallpaper, 31 visible from the chair where she sat, and she thought about what a man like that would want with a woman like her, which was not a romantic question. It was a practical one. She was the daughter of a baron whose land was worth less every year and whose debts had reached the number that required a specific kind of conversation with specific kinds of men. She had no fortune. She had no particular beauty, or so she had been told enough times that she had stopped arguing with it. She had read too many books and had opinions about them, which most men in her experience treated as a personality flaw. What she had, she understood now, was a name that could be attached to his without looking like an admission of anything. What she had was the ability to make the story go away simply by becoming the wife at the end of it. He was not marrying her. He was solving a problem. She happened to be the problem. Her aunt said, when the answer was required of her, that she should be grateful. That a duke was a duke regardless of the reason. That beggars could not be choosers, which was one of those sayings that the people who say it are never the beggar in. Cecily said she would accept. She said it quietly. She said it to the roses on the wallpaper rather than to her aunt's face. She said it the way you agree to a surgery you know is necessary but have not quite convinced your body to cooperate with. She was 23 years old. She had wanted, at various points, to be a painter, a naturalist, a woman who lived in a cottage near the sea and wrote letters to people who wrote back with interesting things. She had wanted, specifically, to marry a man who looked at her like she was something worth looking at, not a complication to be managed. She accepted a duke who had not made eye contact with her in the 11 seconds they had shared the same room. They met formally 4 days later, in her father's parlor, with her aunt present and a tray of tea that no one touched. He was taller than she had registered in the dark of the library. He had the kind of face that had been called handsome enough times that he wore it without thinking about it, the same way very rich men wear their coats. He sat with the ease of someone who had never in his life had to wonder if he belonged in a room. He said all the correct things. She said all the correct things back. Her aunt beamed. Her father looked relieved in the way that people look when a very large number is about to become someone else's concern. At one point, during a pause in the conversation, Edward Ashford looked directly at her. Not at the room. Not at a point near her shoulder. At her face. She held his gaze for 2 full seconds before she looked down at her tea. She could not have said what was in that look. She was not sure she wanted to know. She picked up her cup and said something pleasant about the weather, and the moment passed and she did not think about it again until later that night, in her room, when she was supposed to be sleeping. The wedding was on a Thursday, 10 days after the letter. The church was small. This had been presented to her as a mercy, a small ceremony, nothing to attract more attention, better to let the matter settle quietly. Cecily understood this to mean that he did not want his acquaintances to watch him marry her, which was its own particular kind of information. She wore the good dress. It was ivory silk with a small row of buttons at the cuff, and she had worn it twice before, to occasions far less significant than this one. She had thought about asking her aunt for something new, but she could not make herself do it. The good dress was hers. Whatever happened next, she wanted one thing in the church that was genuinely hers. Her father walked her up the aisle. He was trying to look proud. He did not entirely manage it, but she loved him for the effort. Edward Ashford stood at the altar and did not look at her while she walked toward him. He looked at the vicar. He looked at the stone arch above the east window. When she reached him and they stood side by side, he looked at a point somewhere between the candles and the crucifix, somewhere useful and blank. She counted the floor stones. 42. The same number she had counted in the retiring room, though these were a different shade of grey, more blue in them, the color of a sky deciding whether to rain. The vicar spoke. She answered when she was supposed to answer. Edward answered when he was supposed to answer. His voice was steady and certain and gave nothing away. He signed the register with the pen she had handed him, and for just a moment their fingers were close enough that she felt the warmth of his hand without touching it. She looked at the register. The ink dried. His name was beside hers in the same precise hand as the letter, and the thing was done. His carriage was better than any vehicle Cecily had ever ridden in. The seats were upholstered in something that was probably worth more than the income from 3 of her father's fields. She sat across from her new husband, the words still felt like a stone in her mouth, and watched the city past the window and said nothing, because she had no idea what words were appropriate for this particular journey. He said nothing either. He looked out his window. His profile was very still in the way that either meant he was completely at ease or completely elsewhere. The silence stretched, and she thought about the 42 stones and the way his name looked next to hers in the register and the fact that not a single person she loved had been in that church to watch, and she pressed her hands together in her lap and held them there, steady, until the feeling in her chest was something she could reasonably contain. She was the Duchess of Wrentham. It did not feel like anything yet. She suspected it would feel like something soon. She suspected it would feel like a great many things, none of which she was prepared for, most of which she would handle alone. The carriage moved through the London streets toward a house she had not yet seen, belonging to a life she had not chosen, and she kept her hands together and her eyes on the window and let the city come. 3 days into her marriage, Cecily received a list. It was waiting on her writing desk when she came back from her first walk around the estate grounds, and for a moment she thought it might be something useful, a list of the household staff, perhaps, or the schedule for the week, or some practical information about how this particular house ran and who ran it. She picked it up. She read it. It was a list of expectations. She was to appear at dinner each evening, dressed appropriately. She was to accompany him to the social engagements he was required to attend. She was to conduct herself in a manner that did not invite comment. She was to manage the household. She was otherwise free to organize her time as she saw fit. It was written in his precise, certain hand. The same hand that had signed the register beside her name. Each item was numbered. There were 6 of them. Cecily read the list twice. Then she looked at the fireplace. Then she put the list in the fireplace. She watched it catch and burn and curl and go to ash. She did not feel particularly triumphant about it. It was simply the only honest response she had. If he wanted a woman who would read a list of instructions and nod and fold herself into them, he had made a significant error in his choice of wife. She was many things, broke, untitled by birth, in possession of only one good dress, but she was not the kind of woman who received instructions about how to exist in her own home and filed them respectfully away. She went downstairs and found the cook, a round-faced woman named Mrs. Doyle who had the efficient manner of someone who had survived multiple employers and expected to survive more. Cecily told her the dinner menu needed changing. The current one featured 4 courses of the kind of food that exists to impress rather than to feed anyone, and she wanted something with actual vegetables in it and a pudding that was worth eating. Mrs. Doyle looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, and the matter was settled. She found the steward the next morning on her second walk. His name was Mr. Pryor, and he was 64 and had worked the Rentham estate for 31 years and walked with a slight favoring of his left leg from an old riding injury. He was also, she discovered within 10 minutes of speaking with him, extraordinarily funny in the dry, quiet way that men of great patience sometimes are, the kind of funny that catches you off guard because you are not expecting it. He showed her the grounds. He told her about the estate's history, not the grand official history, but the real one, the one with the floods and the bad harvest and the year the tenant farmers had a dispute with the then duke that everyone in the county still talked about in lowered voices. He told her which fields drained well and which did not, and which of the horses had difficult personalities, and which of the kitchen garden's beds had never properly recovered from a particular frost 3 winters back. She listened to all of it. She asked questions. He seemed surprised that she asked questions, and then pleased, and by the end of the walk they had arrived at something that was not quite friendship but was clearly pointed in that direction. The dog appeared on the 4th day. It belonged to no specific person in the household as far as Cecily could determine, but it seemed to have a particular arrangement with Mr. Pryor involving leftover bread and the corner of the stable yard nearest the kitchen entrance. It was a mid-sized animal with 1 brown ear and 1 white ear and an expression of permanent mild suspicion. It regarded Cecily for a long moment when they first met, in the stable yard, then pressed its nose against her boot and made its decision. She named it 42. She did not explain this to anyone. The books were a separate matter. There was a library in the house, a real library, 2 floors, floor-to-ceiling shelves, a wooden ladder on a rail, the particular smell of paper and time that Cecily found more comforting than most human company. She had stood in the doorway on her second day and looked at it for a full minute before going in. The books were organized with obvious care. History, philosophy, natural science, literature, real literature, not the decorative kind. She took 3 volumes on her first visit without asking. She left them on her bedside table where anyone entering the room would clearly see them. Nobody said anything. She took 3 more the following week. She began to understand the house by its rhythms. The housekeeper, a Mrs. Ellison, operated with the quiet authority of someone who had held the estate together through 2 previous dukes and expected to hold it through a third. She gave Cecily the household account on the 5th day without being asked, set them on the parlor table, and said nothing beyond, "Your Grace will want to review this, I imagine." Cecily reviewed them for 2 hours and found 3 areas where money had been spent on things the house did not need and 1 area where it was not being spent on something it clearly did. She wrote her thoughts in a small notebook and spoke with Mrs. Ellison the next morning, and they came to an understanding that suited them both. The 6th evening at dinner, Edward noticed the menu had changed. He said nothing about it. But she saw him look at the dish in front of him and then look at her with something that was not quite a question and not quite an acknowledgement and was therefore a great deal of both. She looked at her own plate and said pleasantly that she hoped the cook's new approach was acceptable. He said, after a moment, that it was very good. She said she thought so too. That was the longest conversation they had in the first week. Edward Ashford was in the house. She was aware of him the way you are aware of weather, not constantly, but reliably, a presence that set the temperature of the rooms. He appeared at dinner each evening, as she did. They spoke about the estate, the weather, the small events of the day. He was courteous. He was not unkind. He was also, she observed, watching her. Not obviously. Not in a way that declared itself. But she caught it twice in the first week, once across the dinner table when she said something that made Mr. Pryor laugh and she looked up to find Edward's attention on her rather than his plate, and once from an upstairs window when she was in the garden with 42, the morning light still thin, her boots thoroughly ruined by the wet grass, and she felt the quality of the air change the way it does when someone's attention lands on you from a distance. She did not look up to confirm it. She bent down and scratched the dog's ears and kept walking. She had been managing other people's scrutiny her entire life. She was very good at it. She had learned young that the trick was to simply continue existing and let the watching sort itself out. The 8th morning was a Tuesday. She was in the library before 8, which was her habit now, settled into the chair near the south window with a book on the migratory patterns of European birds, which she was finding considerably more engaging than most of the conversations she had been required to have that week. The house was quiet. The dog was at her feet. The light came through the tall windows at the angle that meant winter was not far off. She heard his footsteps in the corridor. She knew them already. His step had a particular weight and evenness to it, the walk of someone who had been raised to take up space without apologizing for it. The footsteps stopped outside the library door. She looked at her book. She turned a page she had not finished reading. He came in. He went to the far section of shelves without looking at her. He selected something. She could hear the small sound of a book leaving its place, and then, instead of leaving, he stayed. She heard him settle into the chair near the north window. The one she had not been using. She turned another unread page. For 40 minutes they sat in the same room with their separate books and said nothing. It was not comfortable exactly. But it was also not what she had expected. She had expected the house to be a place where she was alone in particular rooms and he was alone in different ones, and their paths crossed at dinner and at the front door and nowhere else. She had not expected him to come into the library and sit down with his book as though it was the most natural thing in the world and say nothing about it. She turned back to the page she had skipped. She read it properly this time. The dog shifted at her feet and sighed and did not wake up. When she left, she said, "Good morning." He looked up from his book. There was something in his expression she could not read, something that arrived and departed before she could name it. He said, "Good morning." She walked out. She stood in the corridor for a moment and she thought, "This is not what I planned for and I do not know what it is and I am going to need to be very careful." 42 was waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs. She bent down. She scratched his ears. She was careful, she told herself. She was always careful. She went outside to the garden where the air was cold and clear and did not require anything of her, and she kept walking until her boots were muddy and her thoughts were quieter, and she did not look back at the house to see if anyone was watching from the windows. She discovered that the house itself had opinions. The second-floor parlor received morning light until 10 o'clock and then lost it entirely, which meant it was pleasant for reading until that hour and cold and dim afterward, a fact that no one seemed to have noticed or cared about before she moved the reading chairs to the library. The east sitting room had a chimney that smoked when the wind came from the north, which it did 4 days out of 7 in autumn, and she reported this to Mrs. Ellison, who said yes, it had always been so, and seemed surprised to be asked about it as though a solution might be worth attempting. Cecily wrote a note to a local builder and had the flue examined and cleaned, and the east sitting room stopped smoking, and Mrs. Ellison looked at her for a long moment afterward and then said, "Very good, Your Grace," in a tone that meant something considerably more than the words. These were small things. She was aware they were small things. But small things, she had found, were what a life was mostly made of, and the management of them was the difference between a house that worked and a house that merely stood. She found, by the end of the first week, that the staff had been waiting for someone to ask them things. Not all of them. Some of them were entirely satisfied with the arrangements that existed and had no wish to disturb anything. But Mrs. Doyle the cook had opinions about the kitchen garden that had never been invited, and the head gardener, a quiet man named Mr. Lowe, had been wanting to plant a particular variety of apple tree for 3 years and had not been able to get permission from anyone who paid attention to such requests. Cecily gave him the permission. He planted 4 trees. She walked past the planted sites on her 6th morning and felt something that was not quite satisfaction but was its near neighbor. Mr. Pryor had taken to walking with her most mornings, which she had not asked for and did not discourage. He knew the estate the way you only know a place you have walked every day for 30 years, and he talked about it the way people talk about the things they love without knowing they love them, matter-of-factly, with contained precision, and with the occasional detail that told her everything about what he valued. He told her, on the 9th morning, that the previous Duchess had not liked the grounds. Had found them too exposed, too open, not enough formal garden near the house. Had spent considerable money on a section of walled garden that had never quite taken properly and was now mostly overgrown. He told her this without editorializing. She asked him if he thought it could be reclaimed. He said, carefully, that it would take some work. She said she had time. He looked at her then with the expression of a man recalibrating something. He said he would have a look at it and let her know what could be done. She thanked him. They walked on. The dog moved ahead of them along the path, its white ear bright in the grey morning light, and neither of them said anything more about it, because not everything useful needed to be further discussed. Edward passed them once on these walks. Just once. He was on horseback, coming back from the eastern fields, and he slowed when he saw her and Pryor and the dog, and he looked at the 3 of them on the path with an expression she could not read at any distance. He raised one hand in acknowledgement. She raised hers back. He continued on toward the stables. She and Mr. Pryor continued on toward the lower fields. Pryor said nothing about it. She said nothing about it. But she thought about the expression on his face, that unreadable thing at a distance, for longer than she intended to. She did not look back. Not even once. London arrived like a verdict. The Rentham house in town was everything the country estate was not: closer, louder, full of the particular kind of silence that happens inside large houses when the city presses in around them. Cecily had 3 days to settle before the season began in earnest, which was not enough time to settle at all but was apparently what was available to her. She had been to London before. Twice, with her aunt, for purposes her aunt described as broadening and which had mostly involved standing at the edges of parties where she did not know anyone and looking engaged. She had learned to hold a glass she was not drinking from in a way that suggested she was having a fine time. She had learned the exact expression of pleasant attention that meant nothing was expected of her. She was, as her aunt once said, a sensible girl who understood her situation. Her situation had changed. She was announced now, at every door, as the Duchess of Rentham. She felt the change run through rooms before she entered them. People arranged themselves differently. They looked at her differently. Not warmly, not at first, but with the attention of people trying to figure out what she was, this unknown woman with the muddy boots reputation who had somehow walked into the empty place beside one of the most important titles in England. She did not help them figure it out. She wore her best dress, which was now not the only good one she owned, because the Duchess could not attend the season in one silk gown and an expression of determination, and she had allowed, with specific and limited instructions, a dressmaker to add 4 more. She kept her jewelry simple. She asked questions at dinners and listened to the answers. She spoke her actual opinion, occasionally, on subjects where her opinion was worth something, and she watched people recalibrate. Edward stood beside her at these events. He did this with the same consistency he brought to everything, reliably, without drama, in a way that told the room they were a unit without telling anyone anything more than that. He was good at this. He had been doing it his whole life. What he was not good at, and what she noticed 3 events in, was other men. The first time was at the Pemberton dinner. She was speaking to a Mr. George Holloway, who was something in the Foreign Office and had spent 2 years in Portugal and had very good opinions about birds, which was a subject she genuinely cared about. She had been talking for several minutes, really talking, the kind that happens when you have found someone who knows something you want to know more about, and she was in the middle of a sentence about the particular markings of the Asher-winged magpie when she became aware that someone was standing close behind her. She did not turn. She finished her sentence. She did not need to turn to know who it was. George Holloway's gaze moved fractionally upward and then back to her with the quality of a man who has revised his ambitions. He smiled a smaller version of his smile. He said it had been a great pleasure and that she must speak with his wife about Portugal, who knew a great deal more about birds than he did. He excused himself with the grace of a man who had just remembered another appointment. She turned. Edward was behind her by approximately 2 feet. He was holding a glass of something and looking at the middle distance with an expression of complete social neutrality, the kind of face you put on when you are attempting to establish that you simply happen to be standing in a particular spot. She said, "Did you need something?" He said, "I was just coming to see if you needed a fresh glass." She looked at her glass, which was half full. She looked at his expression. She said, "No, thank you," and went to find George Holloway's wife, who turned out to know a remarkable amount about migratory patterns and was easily the most interesting person at the dinner. She found her, and they talked about birds for 20 minutes, and it was the best conversation she had had since arriving in London. She did not look for Edward. She did not need to. She could feel the specific quality of his attention even across a crowded room, the same way she had felt it from the upstairs window. It had a different texture now. Something tighter. Something she did not have a word for yet. The second time was at Lady Ashmore's musical. Lord Oliver Fenwick was a viscount with an easy smile and a reputation for charming women who should have known better. Cecily knew this from 2 separate sources before he even introduced himself. She had no particular concern about it. She was not a woman who needed protecting from men with easy smiles. She was a woman who could manage a conversation in her sleep. He was charming enough. He sat beside her in the second row, which was not something she had arranged and was not something she had prevented because she had not seen a reason to. He made a quiet joke about the soprano's choice of key. She acknowledged it without laughing, which was her habit with men who expected to be found funny. He adjusted accordingly, which she gave him credit for. When her program slipped from her lap between the second and third piece, he retrieved it. He returned it to her. His fingers grazed her gloved hand for less than a second. Gloved. Brief. The sort of thing that happened in any room where 2 people sat close enough together. She said thank you and looked at the musicians. She heard, rather than saw, the next part. She heard the slight shift in the ambient noise of the room, not much, just enough, a degree of attention redirecting itself, and when she glanced to her left, toward the aisle, Edward was there. He was not between her and Lord Fenwick. He was simply present, standing in the aisle near her row, as if he had just arrived and was looking for his seat. He found it, 3 rows back, where he had been sitting, but he did not go there directly. He stopped for a moment beside her and said, quietly, that he thought the window behind the 3rd row might be letting in a draft and had she been warm enough. She looked at him. He was not looking at Fenwick. He was looking at her, asking about her comfort, in a room full of people, in a voice that carried the specific quality of a man performing one thing while thinking another. She said she was perfectly warm. He said good and went to his seat. Lord Fenwick excused himself to speak with someone he had apparently just noticed across the room. Cecily sat through the rest of the musical and looked at the musicians and thought about nothing in particular, which was something she had become very good at. She thought about nothing in particular with great focus and attention, and she held her program in both hands, and she breathed. The soprano finished her final piece to warm applause, and the guests around Cecily murmured their approval, and she clapped along with them, and she kept her face in its most pleasant and easiest arrangement. On the carriage ride home she sat across from him. The night pressed against the windows. The horses moved them through the lamplit streets with a sound that was almost restful. She said, "Lord Fenwick returned my program." "I know," he said. "He handed it to me," she said. "He was sitting beside me. It was a reasonable thing to do." "Yes," he said. "So I would like to understand," she said, "what you were doing." He looked out the window. The light from passing lamps came and went across his face. He said, "I was concerned about the draft from the window." She said, "There was no draft." He said nothing. She watched him not say anything. She watched him hold his glass of silence with both hands, the way she had learned to hold her glass at parties where she did not belong, and she thought, "He knows exactly what he was doing and he has no intention of telling me." She turned to her window. The city went past. The horses kept their pace. Somewhere a church bell rang 11. The following week was Lady Harrington's ball. Then the Grantham supper. Then the Duke of Marlowe's reception, which was held outdoors in early evening with lanterns in the garden and excellent wine and approximately 120 people, all of whom had come to see each other and be seen. Each event was different. Each event was also, in one particular way, the same. Sir Edmund Vickers at the Harrington ball, who had known Cecily years before when they had both been young and unimportant, and who wanted to tell her what he remembered about her from then. He got through approximately 4 sentences before Edward arrived with 2 glasses of wine, one of which was Cecily's, one of which he appeared to be delivering for the specific purpose of joining the conversation. Edmund Vickers finished his 4th sentence and did not start a 5th. At the Grantham supper, a Mr. Atterley sat across from her and spent the soup course paying her specific and articulate attention. He was interesting. He had read things. She found herself genuinely engaged for the first time in a week. Between the soup and the fish, Edward said something across the table that redirected the conversation toward him, and Atterley politely followed the pull of the room, because Edward Ashford was a duke and rooms arranged themselves around him without being asked to. She watched this happen. She picked up her fork. She thought about the word strategic, and then she thought about the word possessive, and then she thought that neither word was quite right and that she would need to find the right word later when she had time and quiet and no one paying attention to her face. The Marlowe reception was where it became undeniable. She was standing near the lanterns on the garden's west part, talking with a woman named Clara Pemberton who was warm and practical and had 3 children and no interest in anything except genuine conversation, which was refreshing. They were talking about the difficulties of managing a large household, which was something Clara knew a great deal about and Cecily was rapidly learning, and it was the kind of talk that felt like actual contact with the world rather than the performance of it. A young man named Henry Graves came to speak with Clara, who was his cousin, and included Cecily in the conversation with natural ease. He was perhaps 25. He was pleasant. He said something that made both Clara and Cecily laugh, not the polite kind, the real kind, the kind that comes up before you have decided to let it. Cecily was still recovering from the laugh, still in the warmth of it, when she looked up and found Edward on the path. He was not close. He was 15 feet away, perhaps, standing with a group of men she recognized as parliamentary associates of his. He was looking at her. He was not performing indifference. He was not pretending to look at something near her. He was looking directly at her, with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was something unguarded. Something that had arrived before he could put the correct face over it. She held his gaze this time. She did not look down. For 3 seconds they simply looked at each other across the garden path with the lanterns making everything softer than it really was. Then one of his companions said something and he turned, and the moment was gone, and she was back in the conversation with Clara and Henry Graves, and the night continued exactly as it was supposed to. But something had shifted. She was not sure what. She was not sure she wanted to know yet. She was a practical woman and she was managing things one day at a time, and she did not need to add unknowable things to the list of things she was managing. She turned back to Clara. She asked about the oldest of her 3 children, who was apparently arguing about tutors. She listened carefully. She gave her full attention to the conversation. She was very careful. She was always careful. The problem was that somewhere between the 42 floor stones and the library on the 8th morning and the 3 seconds of a garden path in lantern light, careful had started to feel like it cost her something. She learned things about Edward Ashford in London that she had not known at the estate, which was instructive, because it told her that there were different versions of him operating in different contexts, and that the versions were not entirely consistent with each other. At the estate he was contained, deliberate, economical with words in a way that she had initially read as coldness and had slowly come to understand was something more like precision. He did not speak unless he meant to speak. He did not move unless he meant to move. Everything had a purpose, and the purpose was not always visible, and she had spent several weeks learning not to look for it immediately and simply wait. In London he was different. Not warmer, exactly, but more present in rooms. He carried the dukedom with the ease of something he had been born wearing, which of course he had, and rooms responded to it the way they do, arranging, deferring, orienting. She watched men she had known to be confident become somewhat less certain in the architecture of themselves simply by being near him. She watched women who had navigated society for decades calculate and recalibrate their approach when he was in the vicinity. She found it strange that this was the same man who had stood in the corridor outside his own library. She did not say this to anyone. She thought it often. There was also, she discovered, a version of Edward Ashford that appeared in parliamentary conversation, which was a version she found genuinely interesting and did not entirely know what to do with. He was careful in those conversations in a different way than he was careful in social ones. In social situations he was performing a function, the Duke, the host, the husband of the new Duchess everyone was evaluating. In political conversation he was doing something else. He was thinking. She could see it happen, the actual engagement of a mind working through a problem rather than the management of an impression. She sat near one such conversation at the Grantham supper, near, not in it, because she had learned soon enough which conversations she was expected to observe and which she was expected to participate in, and she listened to him argue a position on a land use bill with a clarity and specificity that she found, against her will, persuasive. Not because she agreed with everything he said. She did not agree with all of it, and she had a great many thoughts she was not asked for. But because the argument was genuine. He was not performing an opinion. He had one. She filed this away in the part of her mind where she was keeping the accumulating evidence about who he actually was, which was different from who she had assumed he was, which was different again from who he presented himself to be, and she thought that this was going to be a longer project than she had originally estimated. The social season had its own rhythms and its own mathematics, and she was beginning to learn both. She understood which hostesses controlled the circulation of information and which ones were simply well-meaning. She understood which events carried weight and which were purely decorative. She understood who looked at her with genuine curiosity and who was performing curiosity in order to collect details to report elsewhere. Clara Pemberton became a real friend during those weeks, which was something Cecily had not expected and was grateful for. Clara had the quality of someone who had long since stopped caring about the performance and was simply living her life inside it as honestly as the situation allowed, and she had an eye for the absurd that matched Cecily's own. They began meeting on occasional mornings, at a tea room off the main shopping street that Clara had found years earlier precisely because none of the important people went there. They talked about their children, about their husbands, about the strange nature of the lives they were managing. Clara never asked Cecily directly about Edward, which was one of the things Cecily liked best about her. She simply let the subject exist if Cecily wanted to approach it, and did not push when she did not. She was not yet ready to name what. But it was there, in the chest, the way things are when they are waiting for you to catch up to them. The pattern became visible the way all patterns do, not all at once, but through accumulation. One incident is a coincidence. Two is a question. By the 5th, it had a shape. Cecily began keeping a private accounting of it, not written down, not in any way that anyone could find, just in the part of her mind where she kept the things she was not yet ready to speak. Lord Fenwick's return program. Sir Edmund's 4 sentences. Arthur Lee's redirected conversation. Henry Graves' laugh in the lantern light. Each one fired away under things that happened and then stopped happening. What replaced them, always, was Edward. Not dramatically. That was the thing she kept returning to. He never made a scene. He never raised his voice or made an accusation or positioned himself in a way that could be called anything other than attentiveness. He arrived. He remained. He made the room's geometry slightly different, and men who had been leaning in sat back, and conversations that had been building quietly unwound. She tried, once, to test it. At the Crofton afternoon reception, she placed herself deliberately in a corner of the garden with a Mr. Frederick Ashe, who was a botanist with a paper recently published on the propagation of hybrid roses, which was genuinely interesting, and she gave him her full and undivided attention. 6 minutes and 40 seconds. She counted, with the specific part of her mind reserved for counting. Edward appeared from the direction of the house with the particular unhurried purpose of a man who has decided to take a walk in the garden at this exact moment on this exact path. She looked at him when he reached them. She kept her expression the way she kept it at parties, pleasant, present, giving nothing away. He said, "I thought you might like some shade," and steered her toward a nearby oak with one hand at the appropriate distance from her elbow, not touching, not failing to make the intention clear, and Frederick Ashe was left beside the hybrid roses with his theories and nowhere particular to direct them. She waited until they were under the oak. She said, "I have been married for 11 weeks. He looked at her. He did not answer. She said, "I have been married for 11 weeks and you have interrupted every conversation I have had with a man under the age of 60. He said, "That is not accurate. Mr. Pryor is 52. She stared at him. The audacity of this statement, delivered with his perfectly controlled expression, was something she could not immediately categorize. She was not sure if she was angry or something else. She settled on both. She said, "I would like an explanation." He said, "I am simply insuring." "That is not an explanation," she said. "That is the beginning of one." He stopped. She waited. He looked at the garden beyond her shoulder for a moment. His jaw did something small and controlled. He said, "I am ensuring your comfort at these events." "Frederick Ashe was telling me about hybrid roses," she said. I was comfortable. I was interested. I was in the middle of a sentence. He said nothing. Edward. His name in her mouth felt different than it had in the early weeks. More like something she owned rather than something she was being careful with. "What are you doing?" It was not a question. She said it the way you say a thing when you already know the shape of the answer and you are waiting for the other person to find the same shape. He looked at her then. Directly. The same way he had looked across the garden at Marlowe's reception, unguarded for just a moment, before the controlled face came back over it. The controlled face came back. He said, "I am protecting the family name. These events are visibility for the Rentham title and I have an obligation to ensure." "Stop," she said. He stopped. She was holding her empty glass in both hands. She was pressing her thumbs together in the way she pressed her hands together in carriages when she needed to hold something steady. The garden was warm and the sounds of the reception drifted through the trees, other people's easy conversation, and she stood under the oak with her husband and felt the specific frustration of a person confronting a wall that has no door in it. She said, "I did not marry you to be managed." Something moved across his face. Not the controlled thing. Underneath it. He said, "I know." She waited. There was nothing more. She said, "I am going back to the party," and left him under the oak. She went back to the reception. She found a woman she liked and had a long conversation about literature. She did not look for him. She did not track his position in the room the way she had started, without deciding to, tracking his position in rooms. He was there when the carriage came. He handed her in. He sat across from her. They rode home without speaking, which was not unusual, but the silence was different now, thicker, with the shape of all the things neither of them had said. She went to her room. She sat at her writing desk and did not write anything. She looked at the surface of the desk and thought about the way he had said "I know," the two words, the weight of them, the thing they refused to carry past themselves. She thought about the library on the 8th morning. 2 separate books. 40 minutes of company that had not been asked for or explained or apologized for. She thought about a man who wrote lists of instructions and put them on desks, and a man who stood under an oak tree and said "I know" with an expression that was not the right shape for the family name. She thought about those two men and how they were the same man and what that meant. She was not ready to think about what it meant. She got up. She put on her coat. She went down to the kitchen and found Mrs. Doyle still awake, the good cooks are always still awake, and asked her for a cup of tea and something plain. Mrs. Doyle gave her tea and a slice of bread with butter and did not ask any questions, which was also something good cooks understood. Cecily sat in the kitchen and ate her bread and drank her tea and thought about nothing very successfully for about 10 minutes. Then she thought about the 11 weeks. She thought about how many times, in 11 weeks, something had started to feel like something and she had pressed her thumbs together and held it still. She thought about what it cost to hold things still. She finished her tea. She said good night to Mrs. Doyle. She went back upstairs and did not look at his door as she passed it. She went into her room and closed her door and stood with her back against it in the dark, and she thought, I am going to need to say something to him. Not about the party. Not about Frederick Ashe and his roses. About the real thing. She thought, I am not brave enough for that yet. She thought, I am going to have to become brave enough, because this cannot continue. Whatever this is, this arrangement that is not an arrangement anymore, this marriage that is not performing the way either of them had planned, it cannot continue in this gray space where nothing is said and nothing is named and everything just accumulates in the chest like stones. She lay down. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about 42 floor stones and how she had counted them because she did not know where else to look. The days after the confrontation under the oak were different. Not better exactly. Not worse. Different in the way that rooms are different when the furniture has been moved and you keep reaching for things in the places they used to be. He came to breakfast the morning after the Crofton reception. This was unusual. They had not shared breakfast since the first week, when the timing of their mornings had sorted itself out without discussion into two separate orbits. She was at the table with a cup of tea and her natural history book when he came in, and she looked up, and he looked at the table, and he sat down across from her without either of them saying a word about it. Mrs. Doyle brought him tea and something with eggs and did not appear to find the situation unusual, because Mrs. Doyle had the excellent quality of never finding anything she was not supposed to find unusual. They ate in silence for about 4 minutes. Then he said, "The Hatfield ball is next Thursday." She said, "I know." He said, "I thought we might go together," which was strange phrasing for a married couple going to the same event, but she understood what he meant, which was something about the difference between arriving in the same carriage and actually going together. She said, "Yes." "All right." He looked at his plate. She looked at her book. They finished breakfast in the same careful quiet they had always managed, except that now it had a different quality to it, like the silence after something has been acknowledged rather than the silence before. She thought about the oak tree that afternoon. She was in the kitchen garden with Mr. Lowe, looking at his notes for the reclaimed word section, and she was thinking about what she had said under the oak, "I did not marry you to be managed," and the way he had said "I know" with those particular 2 words carrying everything he was not prepared to say past them yet. She thought, he has been doing this for weeks. Standing in rooms. Redirecting conversations. Presenting himself between her and any man who expressed an interest in her, as though he were guarding something he did not have a right to guard. And he knows it was wrong. And he said so. And what he did not say was why? She was not naive about the why. She had turned the same page 3 times on the 8th morning and she knew what that meant, at least about herself. She was not certain enough yet about him to draw conclusions. Mr. Lowe showed her a sketch of the proposed planting plan for the walled garden. She looked at it carefully. She asked 3 questions. He answered them. She said it looked very good and she would speak with Mr. Pryor about the budget for the first stage. He seemed pleased. She walked back to the house with her coat pulled against the wind and thought, I am going to have to say something to him eventually. Not tonight. Not yet. But eventually. The days moved as days do when something is building underneath them. There were 2 more events before the Hatfield ball, a small dinner at the Westbrook house, and a morning reception at Lady Cotton's that she attended without Edward because he had a parliamentary committee that ran long. At both events she was aware of his absence in the particular way you notice something gone when you have become accustomed to its presence, which was its own kind of information. At Lady Cotton's she had an unexpectedly enjoyable conversation with a woman named Mrs. Dottie Fenn, who was the wife of a member of parliament and who had spent 15 years navigating London society with a sharp and specific intelligence she had clearly never been given sufficient credit for. They talked about the city, about management of large households, about the strange experience of being assessed constantly and how you developed, eventually, a layer of surface that the assessment simply slid off of. Dottie said, toward the end of the conversation, with the directness of someone who had decided she liked Cecily and was going to behave accordingly, you are not what people expected. Cecily said, what did they expect? Dottie said, someone easier to categorize. Someone who would arrange herself around the position rather than the other way. Cecily thought about this. She said, I am not sure I know how to arrange myself around positions. Dottie said, I noticed. It is very refreshing. Don't stop. She went home from Lady Cotton's in a better frame of mind than she had arrived in, which was what a good conversation could do. She changed out of her morning clothes. She went to the library. She was 3 pages into something she had been meaning to return to when she heard, from the corridor, footsteps she recognized. They stopped outside the door, as they sometimes did. She kept her eyes on the page. The door did not open this time. After a moment, the footsteps continued down the corridor and away. She read the page she was on. She read it properly, all the way through, and turned to the next one. She told herself this was fine. She told herself this was simply a man walking down a corridor. She pressed her thumb against the spine of the book and held it there, steady, the way she held things when she needed them to stay where they were. 2 evenings before the Hatfield ball, they had dinner together and something was different about that too. He asked her, over the fish course, what she thought about the Lower East Field and its drainage problem, which was something she and Mr. Pryor had discussed at some length. She told him what she thought. He listened. Not in the way people listen when they are waiting for you to finish so they can tell you what they have already decided, but actually listened, with the attention he brought to the political conversation she had observed at the Grantham supper. He said, when she had finished, that she had understood the problem correctly and that Pryor's proposed solution was probably the right one. She said, I know. I told him to go ahead with it last week. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, good. She said, yes. They finished the fish course. The next course arrived. Mrs. Doyle had made something excellent with pears and a particular kind of soft cheese that Cecily had discovered she liked and had at some point mentioned to the cook, and as the dish was set down she had a sudden clear understanding that Mrs. Doyle had made it on purpose, for her, on this evening specifically. She thought about a household that had been waiting for someone to ask it things. She thought about 11 weeks of small accumulating evidence. She finished her dinner and went to bed at a reasonable hour and lay in the dark and thought about the Hatfield ball on Thursday, which was, she now realized, the same day of the week as the church where she had counted 42 stones. She was not sure what to do with that information. She thought about it anyway, in the dark, until she fell asleep. She fell asleep eventually, and the night passed, and the morning came with its thin grey light and its usual indifference, and London continued outside the windows without caring about any of it. She got up. She put on her coat. She went to find the dog. It was a Thursday again. Cecily noticed this only when she was already inside the Hatfield house, standing at the edge of the upper landing, hearing the noise of the ball rise through the floors like warm air, and thinking that the timing of things was, if nothing else, consistent. She had not wanted to come tonight. That was honest. She had been in the middle of a second reading of a book on natural history that she was enjoying with the specific pleasure of reading something good for the second time, and the prospect of 2 hours in rooms full of people performing happiness had appealed to her less than usual. But she had put on the dark blue dress and let the maid arrange her hair and gone, because she was the Duchess of Wrentham and because Edward had not asked her not to go and because she was not, in the end, a woman who withdrew. The ball was precisely as balls were. Beautiful and loud and full of people having conversations on top of the conversations they were actually having. She made her way through the first floor with Edward beside her, greeting people whose names she had learned in 11 weeks with the diligence of a student, and she smiled and she spoke and she was present. In the first hour she spoke with a Lady Caroline Marsh, who was clever and funny and had just returned from 3 months in Florence and was full of observations about Italian architecture that Cecily found genuinely absorbing. She spoke with a retired general named Sir William Carey who had opinions about field drainage that matched almost exactly the opinions Mr. Pryor had shared about the Wrentham Estate's lower fields, which led to a useful 20-minute exchange that she made a mental note to bring back to Mr. Pryor. She did not look for Edward. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of him in rooms, a known presence, a fixed point, but she did not seek him out and he did not materialize at her elbow in the first hour, which was notable enough that she noted it. The second hour was where she found it harder. Not because anything happened. Because she was standing near the fireplace with her glass, listening to a conversation between 2 women she did not know particularly well, and she was aware in a precise and inconvenient way that she was tired. Not of the party. Of the management of herself. Of the careful arrangement she had been maintaining for 11 weeks, pressing things flat, holding things steady, counting things when she needed to feel the ground under her. She excused herself from the fireplace conversation and walked toward the East Corridor, because she needed a moment that was not a performance. The East Corridor. Pale blue wallpaper. The sound of the orchestra muffled behind her. And at the end of the corridor, a door she recognized. She stopped outside it. She did not go in immediately. She put one hand against the door frame and stood there for a moment, in the corridor, breathing the quiet. Then she opened the door. The library was dark except for the moonlight coming through the tall windows. The same windows he had been standing at, the first night, the night that had started all of this. The books were the same. The smell of paper and time was the same. She went in. She did not light the lamp. She went to the window and she stood where he had been standing and she looked out at the garden below, silver in the moonlight, still and unhurried and completely uninterested in dukes or duchesses or the 11 weeks of things that had accumulated in the chest and been pressed flat. She heard his footsteps in the corridor before she heard the door. She knew them too well by now to mistake them for anyone else's. That even, weighted step. The step of someone who had never been asked to make himself smaller. The door opened. She did not turn. She said, "This is not the retiring room." A bit of silence. Then, behind her, quietly, "I know." She turned. He was in the doorway. The light from the corridor framed him the way it had the first night, except this time there was no surprise on either side. Just the 2 of them and the moonlit room and everything that had been accumulating in the space between them for 11 weeks. He came in. He did not go to the window. He stopped in the middle of the room, and she looked at him and waited. He said, "I owe you an explanation." She said, "Yes." He said, "Several, probably." She said, "Yes." He looked at the floor. For a moment he looked exactly like a man who had rehearsed nothing, which was unusual enough in her experience of him that it told her something important. He ran a hand through his hair. She had never seen him do that before, that small disordered gesture, and then he looked up. He said, "I did not marry you for the right reasons." She said, "I know. I did not accept you for the right reasons." He said, "That is not what I am trying to say." He stopped. He tried again. "I married you because it solved a problem. That was the truth in the beginning. I am telling you this because I am done pretending it was something more graceful. She waited. He said, and somewhere between the beginning and now, it stopped being that. And I did not know what to do with that. So I did the wrong things. Incorrect, intrusive, overcorrected things. I stood too close to you at parties. I ended your conversations. I told you it was about the family name, which was, he stopped again. His jaw moved. Which was not the truth. She was very still. The moonlight was on the floor between them and the orchestra was very far away. She said, what was the truth? He said, I did not want other men to speak to you that way because I could not stand it. He said it directly. Without the controlled face. Just the words, plain and unguarded. Not for the title. Not for Parliament. Because you were in my house reading my books and burning my list and talking to my steward and that dog followed you everywhere and you counted the stones in the church and I did not know you counted things until I asked Prior and he told me that you counted things when you were nervous, and I... He stopped. She said, you asked Prior about me. He said, yes. She thought about Mr. Prior, 64 years old, 31 years of service, the slight favoring of his left leg. She thought about him telling Edward, she counts things when she is nervous. She thought about what it meant that Edward had asked. She said, when did you ask him? He said, the second week. The second week. She was doing the arithmetic. The second week was before the London season. Before Fenwick and Holloway and Atterley and Frederick Ash and his hybrid roses. The second week was the library on the 8th morning, 2 separate books, 40 minutes of company that had not been asked for or explained. She said, you have been doing this since the second week. He said, yes. She let that sit for a moment. She said, and you were not going to tell me. He said, I did not know how to tell you. I had married you for a list of practical reasons and then I was, he spread one hand, briefly, a gesture that was not like him, not controlled at all. I was standing outside my own library while you were inside it and I could not make myself leave the corridor, and I did not have a framework for that. She almost smiled. She stopped it. She said, a framework. He said, I am not a man who handles things without a framework. She said, I noticed. He looked at her. The unguarded look was fully there now. Both of them in a dark library with moonlight on the floor and everything already said that could be taken back. She made him wait. Not cruelly. She was not a cruel person. But she had been waiting for 11 weeks, for the right word, the right moment, the right version of this that she could believe, and she thought it was reasonable to take 30 seconds. She thought about the first night. The library door. 11 seconds. She thought about the 42 stones. She said, in the church. When you signed the register. You did not look at me the entire ceremony. He said, I know. She said, I counted the floor stones. 42. Because I did not know where else to look. He said nothing. He was looking at her very steadily. His face had the quality of a man who is receiving something important and is being careful with it. She said, that is what I was counting. She watched the information land. She watched him hold it. She watched him understand, in the particular way understanding arrives when it is not just about information but about the shape of what someone has quietly carried. He crossed the floor. Not in a rush, but with intention, in that even weighted step, and he stopped in front of her, close enough that the moonlight fell across them both. He said, very quietly, I would like to start again. She looked at him. This man she had married for a list of practical reasons in a small church on a Thursday with one good dress and 42 stones in the floor and no one she loved watching. She said, you cannot start again. There is no again. There is only forward. He said, then forward. She said, forward will require more than framework. He said, I am aware. She said, it will require conversation. Actual conversation. Not lists. He said, no more lists. She said, And you cannot stand between me and people I am speaking to as though I am something you are guarding. He said, I understand. She said, I will tell you when I need you close. And I will tell you when I do not. He said, yes. She was looking at him and he was looking at her, and the orchestra was playing something she did not recognize from very far away, and the garden outside the window was silver and quiet. She said, the next time someone tells you something about me, you could simply ask me yourself. He said, I know. A pause. I was afraid of the answer. She said, what answer were you afraid of? He said, that you were perfectly fine without me standing in the corridor. She thought about the corridor. She thought about the 8th morning and the sound of his book finding its place on the shelf and the way she had not looked up. She thought about how she had not been perfectly fine. She had been competent. She was very competent. But the library on that morning, the Tuesday, the 8th day, she had had him come in and she had told herself she was not going to look up, and she had turned the same page 3 times. She said, I am going to tell you something true. He waited. She said, I was not perfectly fine. I was competent. I am very competent. But the library on that morning, the Tuesday, the 8th day, I had you come in and I told myself I was not going to look up, and I turned the same page 3 times. The look on his face then. She did not have a word for the look on his face. She thought about all the words she had tried out over 11 weeks, the watching from windows, the corridor, the acts prior in the 2nd week, and she thought about how none of the words had been quite right, and how the look on his face right now, this unguarded, unframeworked, thoroughly unpractical look, was the first thing in 11 weeks that fit the shape of what had actually been happening between them. She said, I turned the same page 3 times. He said, I left the corridor twice and came back. She said, twice. He said, I came back the 2nd time because I heard you sigh. She stared at him. He said, you sigh when you find a passage you particularly like. I had noticed that. She said, you noticed that. He said, in the 1st week. She thought about him noticing her sigh. She thought about him in the corridor, twice, leaving and returning. She thought about the arithmetic of all these small counted things, stored and noted and not said, and she thought that she was going to need a moment. She turned to the window. She looked at the garden for a moment. Silver and quiet. Then she turned back. She said, when we go back out to that bar, you are going to let me finish my sentences. He said, yes. She said, and you are going to introduce yourself properly to people I am speaking with and then move on. He said, yes. She said, and tomorrow morning you are going to come to the library at your usual time, and we are going to be in the same room with our separate books, and you are not going to speak if I have not finished a page. He said, I never spoke first. She said, I know. I noticed. Something changed in his expression then. Something lighter, something she had not seen before. Not quite a smile, or the beginning of one, a thing that had not yet decided to be what it was. She thought, there it is. That is the actual person. She thought, I have 11 weeks of information about the controlled version and approximately 30 seconds of the actual person, and I think the actual person is going to be considerably more complicated and considerably more worth the trouble. She said, come. We are going to go back to the party. She walked toward the door. She was past him when he said her name. She stopped. He said, Cecily. She had heard her name from him before, at dinners, in introductions, in the neutral courteous way of a man observing the correct forms. She had not heard her name from him the way he had just said it. She turned. He said, the next Thursday. After the season. When we go back to the estate. She waited. He said, I would like to walk the grounds. With you? In the morning. If Priya and the dog are also there, that is acceptable. She thought about the morning walks. Muddy boots and cold air and the estate opening itself up to her one field at a time. The part of the day she had not shared with anyone because there had been no one to share them with. She said, I walk at first light. He said, I will be ready. She stood there for a moment in the doorway of the library in the Hatfield house where it had all started, 11 weeks ago, 11 seconds, 42 stones. She said, "Good." She went back to the bar. He followed. Not beside her immediately, he gave her the corridor, let her reach the landing first, which was something she noticed and fired away under, things that are different now. She was at the top of the stairs when he came up behind her, and they went down together, into the noise and the light and the 200 people performing their evenings, and it was exactly as it had always been, the two of them at the same events in the same rooms. Except that she had just told him she turned the same page 3 times and he had told her he came back twice and heard her sigh, and that information was now living between them in the permanent way that true things live, unmovable, not to be unfired. She walked into the ballroom. The music was bright. Someone called her name from across the room and she looked up and smiled, the real smile, not the reception smile. She could feel him just behind her right shoulder. Not hovering. Present. Two different things. She thought about first light on a Thursday. Cold air and muddy boots and a man who had asked the steward about her in the second week and was terrible at saying the true thing and had come back twice to the corridor. She thought about forward. She went to find someone interesting to talk to, and she finished all of her sentences, and the night moved around her the way nights do when something inside them has quietly and permanently changed. She did not count anything. She did not need to.